The gun hit the aisle first. Not fired. Dropped. The sound cracked through the cabin like a bone snapping, metal skidding across carpet, spinning once, twice, before stopping against the leg of a seat. Every breath on the plane froze in the same instant. 3 seconds earlier, no one had been screaming. 3 seconds later, a woman in the third row was crying into her hands, shoulders shaking, the sound caught in her throat like something choking to get out. The man who dropped the gun did not look surprised. He looked annoyed. Mid-40s, thick neck, cropped grey hair, a jacket that was too heavy for a pressurized cabin. He stared down at the weapon as if it had betrayed him personally, then lifted his gaze and swept the aisle with calm, practiced contempt. He did not rush to pick it up. He did not have to. "Sit back," he said, voice low, steady, carrying without effort. "Hands where I can see them. This isn't about you." A flight attendant stood frozen 2 steps away, her service cart skewed sideways, one wheel rattling softly against the floor with each tremor of turbulence. Her name tag read Claire Dawson, late 50s, grey threaded through dark hair pulled too tight at the nape of her neck. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. She had been reaching for a cup of coffee when the man stood up, and the aisle changed forever. In the cockpit, a warning chime sounded once, sharp and insistent, then cut off. Row by row, the cabin realized something was wrong. Not the normal wrong of delays or lost luggage or rough air. This was a different wrong, a heavy one. A wrong that settled into the chest and stayed there. People leaned back into their seats as if gravity had suddenly doubled. A retired school principal clutched the armrest until her knuckles went pale. A man in a denim jacket whispered his wife's name over and over, not loud enough for her to hear. Near the back, a second man stood. Younger, late 30s, nervous energy leaking out of him in sharp movements. He blocked the rear galley without raising his voice, just spreading his arms slightly, like a bouncer who had done this too many nights to bother explaining. No weapon visible. He didn't need one. The third man was already gone, moving toward the cockpit with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The aircraft lurched, a soft shudder. Seatbelt signs chimed on automatically, absurd and polite. "Everyone stay seated," the first man said. "This plane is under new management." The words landed differently for everyone. For some, they meant fear. For others, disbelief. For one woman, halfway down the aisle, they meant something else entirely. Margaret Hale stood near row 12, her hands wrapped around the edge of a seat back to steady herself. She had not screamed. She had not cried. She had not moved when the gun fell. She was 61 years old, with a posture that came from decades of standing, when it would have been easier to sit, and eyes that missed very little. To the casual observer, she looked like what she was pretending to be, another aging flight attendant with sore knees and a practiced smile. Inside her chest, something old and unwelcome had woken up. The man with the gun noticed her because she did not look away. He liked fear. He could read it easily. The woman by the window, shaking. The teenager with his headphones still on, frozen in denial. The businessman whose face had gone flat and pale as paper. Margaret's eyes were steady, not defiant, just present, watching. "You," he said, pointing at her with an open hand. "Coffee. Now." Margaret nodded once. No rush, no hesitation. She moved the cart aside with care, the way she always did, making space in the aisle. As she passed him, close enough to smell gun oil and stale cologne, he noticed her hands. They were not shaking. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "Sweet," he muttered. "This'll go easy." From row 8, Harold Jensen leaned forward just enough to see past the shoulders in front of him. 72 years old, former union electrician. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he'd heard the gun hit the floor. He'd heard the man say the plane was under new management. He watched Margaret walk away, her back straight, her steps measured. He'd flown enough in his life to know flight attendants. He'd watched his share of people under stress. Something about her pace set his teeth on edge. "Margie," he whispered, barely moving his lips. He didn't know why he used her name. Maybe because he'd heard it earlier, when she'd joked about the weather in Denver. She did not look back. She did not need to. The man near the rear galley shifted his weight, eyes scanning the cabin, memorizing faces. A woman in the aisle sobbed quietly, pressing a tissue to her mouth. He watched her for a second, then looked away, bored. This was supposed to be clean, fast, minimal noise. The third man would handle the cockpit. The rest was theater. In the galley, Margaret poured coffee. The machine hissed softly, steam fogging the stainless steel. Her reflection stared back at her, warped and fractured. She took a breath through her nose. Slow, controlled. The way she had learned long before this job, in places where mistakes had names and consequences. She set the cup on a tray and turned. The man with the gun was talking now, explaining rules. Sit, stay calm, cooperate. He spoke like someone who expected to be obeyed, because he usually was. When he saw the coffee, he smiled. A small thing, a reward for compliance. "See," he said to no one in particular. "We're all professionals here." Margaret stopped one step away from him, close enough that he could see the faint scar along her jawline, mostly hidden by makeup. He reached for the cup. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly. "Margaret," she said. "Last name?" "Hale." Something flickered across his face, a microsecond of surprise. It was gone almost before it arrived. "Funny," he said. "Same as mine." She did not smile. Behind them, the cabin breathed in and held it. The gun lay on the floor, forgotten, but no one moved toward it. Not yet. People watched the exchange the way they watched storms through windows, hoping distance meant safety. In the cockpit, a door slammed. A voice shouted once, cut off sharply. Margaret placed the tray down. Her hand brushed the edge of the counter. She felt the vibration of the aircraft through the soles of her shoes, the hum of engines, the thin wall between order and chaos. For the first time since standing up, the man's confidence wavered. Not because of her posture, not because of her eyes. Because somewhere, deep under the noise and adrenaline, a memory was surfacing. A briefing room. A name spoken with weight. A woman who did not raise her voice, but made rooms go silent. He looked at her again. Really looked this time. "You've been flying a long time," he said. Margaret met his gaze. "Long enough to know when people underestimate what they're sitting next to." The man laughed. Too loud, too sharp. He reached for the gun. That was when the plane hit turbulence hard enough to rattle overhead bins and shake loose a chorus of gasps. Coffee sloshed. Someone screamed. In that instant of movement and sound, Margaret shifted her weight, just a fraction, aligning herself with the aisle, with the exits, with the men she could see, and the one she couldn't. Harold Jensen felt it then. Not hope, something heavier. Recognition. The same feeling he'd had once, decades ago, watching a foreman step into a live line because no one else could. The turbulence passed. The cabin settled. The man's fingers closed around the gun. Margaret did not move. Not yet. The gun came up fast. Too fast for the woman in row 3. Too fast for the man clutching his wife's hand. Too fast for anyone who still believed this was a misunderstanding. The muzzle swept the cabin in a slow arc. Not aiming, just reminding. Margaret watched the movement the way some people watched weather. She counted breaths. 1, 2. The man's wrist was tight, tension high, adrenaline driving speed over control. That mattered. "Eyes forward," he said. "Nobody moves unless we say so." Someone did anyway. A man near the window, late 60s, heart medication rattling in his pocket, tried to stand, maybe to speak, maybe to plead. The younger hijacker near the rear took one step toward him, not running, not shouting, just closing distance. The message landed. The man sank back into his seat, breathing hard, ashamed of his own fear. Margaret picked up the tray again and moved. She did not rush. Rushing invited attention. She moved the way she always did, steady, deliberate, invisible by habit. The aisle felt narrower now, the air thicker. She could hear her own pulse, slow and stubborn in her ears. She hated that sound. It reminded her of places she had promised herself she would never return to. The cockpit door stayed closed. That worried her more than the gun. Silence from behind a locked door was never a good sign. "Margaret," someone whispered again. "Harold." She caught the movement of his lips without turning her head. She let her hand brush the seat back as she passed him, a light touch, barely there. Not reassurance, a signal. Sit tight, not yet. The man with the gun tracked her with his eyes as she returned the empty tray to the galley. He smiled again, thin and humorless. "You're calm," he said. "Most people aren't." "I've been flying a long time," she replied. The truth, stripped down to something harmless. "That's so." He leaned closer. She could see the scar along his temple now, pale and old. "Then you know how this goes. You do what you're told, and everybody walks away." Margaret looked at the gun, then at his face. "That depends," she said softly, "on who's telling the truth." His smile vanished. For a second, something sharp flashed behind his eyes. Then the older man reasserted himself, voice low, controlled. "You think you're clever." "I think," she said, "that people who talk the most are usually covering for something." He straightened, anger pulling at the corners of his mouth. "Back to work." She nodded and turned away. She felt the weight of his stare between her shoulder blades all the way to the galley. Behind the curtain, her hands finally shook. Not from fear, from restraint. She pressed her palms flat against the counter, grounding herself in the cold metal. She listened. The engines, the murmurs, the cadence of men who believed they were in control. She reached into the storage compartment and checked what she already knew would be there. Medical kit, fire extinguisher, nothing that would stop a bullet. Nothing that would stop 3 men who had planned this. She closed her eyes for 1 second, not longer. Longer invited memory. A voice from the cockpit crackled through the intercom. Not an announcement, just static, then silence. The man with the gun stiffened. The younger one, near the rear, looked toward the front, jaw tight. Margaret pulled the curtain aside and stepped back into the aisle. "What's going on up there?" the leader snapped. The younger man shrugged. "Probably the pilot trying something stupid." "Go check." The younger man hesitated. Just a fraction. It was enough. The leader noticed. "Now." As the younger man moved forward, Margaret felt the shift ripple through the cabin. People leaned in without realizing it. Fear changing shape, becoming something closer to anticipation. That was dangerous. Hope got people killed. Harold Jensen wiped his palms on his jeans and stared at the floor. He had seen this before. Different setting. Same tension. The waiting that stretched until it snapped. The younger hijacker stopped 2 rows short of the cockpit. He knocked once, hard. No answer. He knocked again, louder. "Open the damn door." Nothing. He turned, frustration bleeding into his movements. They're not responding. The leader cursed under his breath and took 2 steps toward the cockpit, gun raised. That was the moment Margaret had been waiting for. Not because it was perfect, because it was imperfect. Because his attention shifted. Because the younger man was now between them, blocking sight lines. "Sir," Margaret said, just loud enough to cut through the air. He turned. She held up a small white packet. "A passenger needs this. Heart condition." He stared at it, then at her. "You think I care?" "I think," she said evenly, "you don't want someone dying on you before you're done." For a long beat, he said nothing. The cabin waited. Even the engines seemed quieter. "Fine," he said at last. "Make it quick." She moved toward row 15. The man there was pale, sweat beading along his hairline. His wife clutched his arm, eyes wide. Margaret knelt beside him, her back to the aisle, her body a shield that looked like compassion. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "When I stand up," she said, "duck." The man blinked. His wife shook her head, confused. Margaret squeezed his hand once, hard. She stood. The leader had turned back toward the cockpit. The younger hijacker shifted his weight, bored, impatient. Margaret took 1 step into the aisle, then another, positioning herself where the light from the overhead panels caught her face. "Now," she said. The man in row 15 dropped out of his seat as the fire extinguisher discharged with a violent hiss. White cloud. Screams. Chaos detonated in an instant. The younger hijacker cursed, blinded, staggering back. The leader spun, gun coming up, but Margaret was already moving, the way she had sworn she never would again, her body remembering what her mind had tried to forget. She did not think of it as fighting. She thought of it as stopping. The extinguisher hit the leader's wrist, bone on metal. The gun clattered away, skidding down the aisle again, lost in the fog. Someone shouted. Someone prayed. Margaret felt pain bloom along her forearm as a blow landed, sharp and heavy, but she did not slow. Harold Jensen was on his feet now, shouting at no one and everyone. "Down! Everybody down!" People listened, not because he was loud, because his voice carried the weight of certainty. The younger hijacker swung wildly. Margaret slipped inside the arc, driving her shoulder into his chest, knocking the air from him. He fell hard, gasping. She did not linger. Lingering was how you got killed. The leader recovered faster. He always would. Experience mattered. He lunged, tackling her into the galley wall. Pain exploded along her ribs. She tasted blood. He was strong, stronger than he looked. His breath was hot in her ear. "I knew it," he snarled. "I knew there was something wrong with you." She pressed her forehead against his jaw and whispered, "There always is." The cockpit door burst open. Everyone froze. The co-pilot stood there, hands shaking, eyes wild, a streak of blood along his temple. Behind him, the captain lay slumped in his seat, unmoving. The leader looked from Margaret to the open door and back again. His expression changed, calculation replacing rage. Margaret felt the shift, felt the moment narrowing. This was no longer about control. It was about survival, and the story everyone thought they were in had just changed. The cabin did not explode into cheers. It collapsed into noise, raw, human noise. Crying, shouting, someone vomiting into a seat-back pocket, someone else praying out loud without caring who heard. The white cloud from the extinguisher hung in the air, stinging eyes, coating tongues with a bitter chemical taste. Margaret pushed herself off the galley wall, ribs screaming, lungs burning as she dragged in air that did not want to come. The leader did not run. That was the first mistake people expected. He backed away slowly, hands raised just enough to look compliant, eyes never leaving her. His face was bleeding now, a thin line along his cheekbone. But he was smiling again. Not wide, tight, focused. "You really are something," he said. "All this time, hiding in plain sight." Margaret did not answer. Words wasted oxygen. She shifted her stance, feeling the floor through her shoes, measuring distance, exits, people. The co-pilot stood frozen in the doorway, shock locking his joints. He had not expected to open the cockpit to this. "Get back inside," Margaret said, not looking at him. The co-pilot hesitated. Authority did not usually sound like that from a flight attendant. Then he saw her eyes. He stepped back without another word and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gavel. The younger hijacker groaned somewhere near the aisle, rolling onto his side, coughing hard, eyes red and wild. He was not done. Margaret knew that. Pain slowed people like him. It did not stop them. The leader took another step back. "You think you've won," he said. "You haven't." "I'm not trying to win," Margaret replied. Her voice surprised her. Calm, even. "I'm trying to end this." "That's the problem," he said softly. "So am I." From the rear, the second hijacker shouted something in a language Margaret did not bother to identify. The tone mattered more than the words. Alarm, anger, coordination. Margaret turned her head slightly. Harold Jensen was standing in the aisle, chest heaving, one hand braced against a seat. He caught her eye. He nodded once. Not bravado, acceptance. "Everyone down!" he yelled again. "Do it now!" This time, people moved. Bodies folded into seats. Heads disappeared behind armrests. The cabin shifted from chaos to survival mode in seconds. Margaret felt a flicker of something dangerously close to gratitude. The leader lunged, not at her, past her. His hand closed around the shoulder of a woman 2 rows back, yanking her upright, gun appearing in his other hand as if conjured from thin air. Not the one he dropped. Another, smaller, concealed well. "No," Margaret said, sharp now. The woman screamed, high and piercing, hands clawing at his arm. He pressed the muzzle against her neck. "Everybody freeze." The younger hijacker had found his feet. He staggered forward, wiping his eyes, fury pouring off him in waves. "Shoot her," he spat. "Just do it." Margaret's mind slowed. This was the part people never saw. The space where time stretched, where options narrowed to edges sharp enough to cut. She raised her hands slowly, palms open. "You don't want to do this," she said. "You've already lost control of the cabin." The leader laughed. Control isn't the point anymore. Behind him, the rear hijacker was advancing, eyes darting, recalculating. He was the real problem, always had been. The quiet ones were. Margaret took one careful step forward. "You let her go," she said, "and we can still talk about how this ends." "Talk?" the younger one sneered. "She broke my nose." "That's on you," Margaret said without looking at him. The leader tightened his grip on the woman, pulling her closer. She sobbed, gasping for breath. Margaret saw the tremor in the leader's hand. Small, but there. Adrenaline was burning him out faster than he realized. From somewhere behind her, a voice spoke up. Old, steady. "Son," Harold said, "you don't want to live with this." The leader snapped his head around. "Sit down." Harold did not. He took one slow step into the aisle. "I've buried friends," he said. "Good men, over bad decisions that felt right at the time." The younger hijacker laughed. "Shut up, old man." Harold ignored him. His eyes stayed on the leader. "You think this ends clean," he said. "It won't. It never does." For a heartbeat, Margaret thought the leader might actually listen. Then the rear hijacker moved. Margaret reacted without thought. She drove forward, all the force she had left pouring into motion, slamming into the leader's side just as the gun fired. The sound was deafening in the confined space. The woman collapsed, screaming but alive, blood blooming across her sleeve where the bullet had grazed her arm. Margaret hit the floor hard, the leader on top of her. The gun skidded away again, lost under seats. The younger hijacker charged, shouting, kicking at bodies. Someone grabbed his leg. He went down, swearing, flailing. Margaret rolled, using the leader's momentum, driving her elbow into his ribs. She felt something give. He grunted, air rushing out of him. He still fought. He always would. He had not survived this long by quitting. The rear hijacker reached them, knife flashing. Margaret twisted, the blade slicing fabric instead of flesh by inches. She caught his wrist, fingers locking, torque applied just enough. He screamed. The knife clattered away. The cabin surged. Passengers piled in, fear turning into something else. Not courage. Necessity. Hands grabbed arms, legs tangled. The rear hijacker went down under a wave of bodies. The younger one vanished beneath fists and knees. Margaret found herself pinned against the floor, breath ragged, the leader's weight crushing her. His face was inches from hers, eyes wild now, mask finally gone. "Who are you?" he rasped. She looked at him, really looked, and felt, unexpectedly, a flicker of sadness. "Someone who tried to walk away," she said. She drove her knee up, hard. He collapsed, the fight leaving him in a rush. The cabin noise receded, replaced by sobbing, gasping breaths, the sound of people realizing they were still alive. Margaret lay there for a second longer than she needed to. The ceiling lights blurred. Her ribs throbbed with every breath. She closed her eyes, then opened them again. No time for that. Hands reached for her. Someone helped her sit up. She waved them away and forced herself to her feet. The aisle was a mess of bodies, spilled bags, blood, extinguished fear. The cockpit door opened again. The co-pilot stepped out, face pale, eyes fixed on her. They're down." "For now," Margaret said. "You need to get us on the ground." He nodded, swallowing hard. "The captain's alive," he said. "Barely." Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle onto her shoulders, heavy and familiar. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking now. "Okay," she said. "Then we don't waste time." Harold Jensen appeared at her side, breathing hard, shirt torn, a bruise already ballooning along his cheek. He looked at her like he had been waiting his whole life to say this. "You knew what you were doing." Margaret met his gaze. The truth pressed at the back of her throat, sharp and unwelcome. "I used to," she said. The co-pilot cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, voice unsteady. "I need help." Margaret turned toward the cockpit, toward the place she had sworn she would never sit in again. The cabin watched her go, eyes following her down the aisle, understanding dawning in pieces. Not applause, not relief. Something quieter, heavier. As Margaret crossed the threshold into the cockpit, the weight of the door in her hands, she felt the past rise up around her, not as memory, but as muscle and instinct and choice. This time, she did not turn away. The cockpit smelled like burned coffee and fear. Old fear, the kind that lingered even after the source was gone. Margaret stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a heavy, mechanical thud that sounded final in a way she felt in her bones. The co-pilot, Daniel Reyes, sat rigid in his seat, hands hovering inches above the controls, like he was afraid to touch them. He looked young up close, mid-30s. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform. His eyes kept flicking to the captain, slumped forward, oxygen mask crooked against his face. "He's breathing," Daniel said quickly, as if defending himself against an accusation. "Shallow, but steady." "I couldn't," I didn't know if I should move him. You did the right thing, Margaret said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She moved to the captain, checking the pulse at his neck with practiced fingers. Weak. Present. She adjusted the mask, tilted his head just enough to open the airway. The motion was automatic. She had done this before. Too many times. Daniel watched her hands. You're not medical? No, she said. I'm worse. She straightened and took in the cockpit in one long sweep. Altitude, heading, airspeed, fuel. Her eyes moved without effort, slotting numbers into a picture she had spent a lifetime learning how to see. The plane was stable, autopilot engaged. That was something. That was luck. Listen to me, she said, finally turning to Daniel. You're going to fly this aircraft. I'm not here to take your seat. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped for an hour. Thank God. But, she continued, you're not doing it alone. His jaw tightened. You said you used to. Yes. That's not the same as now. No, she agreed. It's not. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of engines and the faint, distant noise of the cabin beyond the door. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands, then dropped them to his thighs. They took the transponder offline, he said. We're not talking to anyone. Margaret nodded. She reached past him, fingers moving with careful restraint, not touching anything yet. Can you bring it back manually? I think so, he said, if they didn't damage the wiring. Then do it, she said. Slow. No sudden moves. Pretend you're alone. Daniel glanced at her, then back at the panel. His hands finally settled onto the controls. He flipped a switch. Nothing. Tried another. A soft click. Then a tone. The radio crackled faintly. Denver Center, Daniel said, voice shaking despite his effort to control it. This is Flight 732. Do you copy? Static. Then, blessedly, a voice. Calm, unhurried, professional. Flight 732, Denver Center. We copy you. State your situation. Daniel swallowed. He looked at Margaret. She nodded once. We've had a security incident, he said. Multiple injuries. Captain incapacitated. We need priority landing. There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough to feel like a held breath. Copy, 732. Squawk 7700. You are cleared direct to Denver. Emergency services will be standing by. Daniel's shoulders sagged. He nodded, fingers moving faster now, confidence bleeding back in by degrees. Margaret felt something loosen inside her chest. Not relief. Readiness. Behind them, the captain stirred, a low groan escaping his throat. Margaret turned immediately, placing a hand on his shoulder. Easy, she said quietly. You're safe. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Margaret, he murmured, voice slurred. We're handling it, she said. You rest. He tried to say something else, then slipped back into unconsciousness. Daniel stared at her. He knows you. We've flown together, she said. Not a lie, not the whole truth. The plane shuddered lightly as they began their descent. Outside the windshield, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, pale blue fading into thin clouds. Margaret watched it the way she always had, with a mix of respect and wariness. The sky had never cared who you were. It only cared what you did. In the cabin, the aftermath was setting in. The adrenaline crash came in waves. People cried openly now, shaking, clinging to each other. A woman pressed a wad of napkins to a bleeding arm, her face chalk white. Harold Jensen sat slumped in his seat, hands trembling, staring at nothing. When a younger man thanked him through tears, Harold just nodded, eyes distant. as if he had been pulled back to another time entirely. 2 passengers kept watch over the restrained hijackers, zip ties biting into wrists, improvised knots holding legs together. No one spoke to them. They lay there, breathing hard, stripped of their power, and suddenly very small. Claire Dawson, the other flight attendant, moved through the aisle like she was underwater, handing out water she barely remembered pouring. She stopped near Harold and knelt beside him. "You okay?" she asked. He blinked, looked at her, then nodded. "Didn't think I had that in me anymore." Claire glanced toward the cockpit door. Neither did she. Harold followed her gaze. "Some people never lose it," he said. "They just get tired." Back in the cockpit, Margaret felt the ache in her ribs deepen as the adrenaline faded. She ignored it. Pain was familiar. Pain could wait. She leaned closer to Daniel, pointing out a minor adjustment to their approach, careful to phrase it as suggestion, not command. He took it without question. Trust, once earned, came quickly in moments like this. "You were military," he said suddenly. Margaret did not answer right away. She watched the horizon, the thin line where sky met land. "I was a lot of things," she said finally. Daniel nodded. He did not press. He did not need the details. Not yet. The intercom chimed softly, a request. Margaret reached up and answered it herself. "This is Margaret," she said. "We're preparing to land. Please remain seated. Help each other if you can. We'll be on the ground soon." Her voice carried through the cabin, calm and firm. And something shifted. People listened. They believed her. She felt the weight of that settle onto her shoulders again, heavier now, edged with something like grief. As the runway came into view, long and solid and real, Margaret allowed herself one brief thought she had not let surface in years. She had never really left this behind. She had just been waiting for a reason to come back. The wheels touched down hard but true. The aircraft shuddered, then steadied, rolling forward as reverse thrust roared. Applause did not erupt. Not yet. People were too exhausted, too overwhelmed for that. Instead, there was a collective exhale, long and shaky, the sound of 100 lives stepping back from the edge at once. Emergency vehicles raced alongside them, lights flashing, silent through the glass. Daniel guided the plane to a stop, hands finally relaxing on the controls. He looked over at Margaret, eyes shining with something close to awe and something closer to fear. "We're down," he said. Margaret nodded. She felt suddenly, profoundly tired. Outside, the world waited. And she knew, with the certainty that settled deep in her chest, that nothing would ever be quiet again. The door opened to noise. Sirens, radios crackling, shouted commands layered over one another until language dissolved into urgency. The moment the aircraft came to a full stop, the illusion of safety gave way to procedure, and procedure did not care about gratitude or relief. It cared about control. Margaret remained seated until Daniel released the brakes and shut down the engines. Only then did she stand, every joint protesting, ribs burning with each breath. She reached for the intercom again, but her hand paused a fraction of a second above the panel. This was the last moment she would have control over how this story began to leave her hands. "Please remain seated," she said at last. "Emergency personnel are approaching the aircraft. Follow their instructions. We will deplane row by row." Her voice did not shake. That surprised her. The cockpit door opened, and 2 armed officers surged in, weapons raised, eyes scanning, bodies coiled. They took in the scene in less than a second. The unconscious captain, the co-pilot upright but pale, the woman in a torn uniform standing where she did not belong. "Hands where we can see them," one officer barked. Margaret raised her hands slowly. The motion pulled at her ribs, and she hissed despite herself. "Easy. Daniel said quickly. "She's with us." She helped stop them. The officers did not lower their weapons. Experience had taught them better than that. One of them glanced past Margaret toward the cabin, where paramedics were already forcing the door open from the outside, their faces set and focused. "Mom," the officer said, tone clipped. "Step away from the controls." Margaret complied without argument. She stepped back, leaning lightly against the bulkhead to steady herself. The officer's gaze lingered on her face, on the blood dried at her temple, on the way she carried herself. He saw it. She knew he did. In the cabin, the first wave of emergency responders moved fast. Paramedics knelt beside the injured woman with the grazed arm. Another checked the younger hijacker's nose, now visibly broken. Two more approached the leader, who lay on his side, wrists bound, eyes open but unfocused. He watched the ceiling like a man watching clouds, detached from whatever consequences were about to arrive. Harold Jensen stood slowly as officers passed him, his knees protesting the effort. A medic tried to guide him back into his seat, but he shook his head. "I'm fine," he said. "Check her." He pointed toward the cockpit. Claire Dawson hovered near the galley, hands clasped so tightly they shook. When she saw Margaret emerge, escorted by officers, something in her face collapsed. "Oh my God," she whispered. She started forward, then stopped herself, remembering where she was. Passengers began to speak all at once. Questions, thanks, accusations. A man shouted that he had a heart condition. A woman demanded to know why it had taken so long. Someone cried that their husband was bleeding. The sound rose and fell like surf. Margaret felt herself retreat inward, the way she always did when too many voices competed for space. She focused on the floor, on the feel of solid ground beneath her shoes, on the simple fact that the plane was no longer moving. An FBI agent appeared at the cockpit door, badge visible, eyes sharp and assessing. He took in Margaret, the officers, the co-pilot, and nodded once. "Who's in charge here?" The officer nearest Margaret gestured toward Daniel. "He's the co-pilot. Captain's down." The agent looked at Margaret. "And you are?" "Flight attendant," she said automatically. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. He glanced at her, uncertain. The agent studied her face for a long moment. "You don't look like a flight attendant," he said. Margaret met his gaze. "I've heard that before." She was led out of the cockpit and into the aisle, past rows of faces that turned toward her in unison. The looks varied. Gratitude, fear, confusion, suspicion. One man clapped weakly, then stopped when his wife grabbed his arm. Applause felt wrong. Too soon, too simple. As she passed row 8, the woman who had been held at gunpoint reached out and caught her sleeve. Margaret stopped instantly, turning to face her. "You saved me," the woman said, voice breaking. "You saved all of us." Margaret swallowed. "We did," she said quietly, gesturing to the cabin. "Together." The woman nodded, tears spilling over. She let go. Near the rear, Harold Jensen stood with his hands resting on the seatback in front of him, steadying himself. When Margaret reached him, he did not speak right away. He just looked at her. Really looked. "I knew," he said finally. "Not what, but that you were more than you said." Margaret held his gaze. "I didn't want to be." He smiled sadly. "None of us ever do." An officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am?" Margaret nodded once to Harold and moved on. Outside, the jet bridge connected with a dull thump. Cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of fuel and wet concrete. Flashing lights painted the cabin in red and blue. Cameras were already visible beyond the glass, lenses pressed close, hungry. Margaret paused at the door. For a fleeting moment, she considered staying inside, letting someone else step out first, delaying the inevitable. Then she straightened her shoulders and stepped forward. The noise hit her like a wall. Shouts, questions, her name spoken incorrectly and repeatedly. Someone yelled, "Hero." Someone else yelled, "Liar." An officer guided her down the steps, hand firm on her elbow. At the bottom, a man in a dark suit waited, his posture too precise to be accidental. Grey hair, late 60s. He watched her, with an expression she recognized instantly. Recognition. "Margaret Hale," he said when she reached him. Not a question. She closed her eyes for half a second. When she opened them, the past was standing in front of her, wearing a badge instead of a uniform. "It's been a long time," he said. "Yes," she replied. "It has." Cameras surged closer, microphones thrust forward. "Ma'am, can you tell us what happened on board? Is it true you stopped the hijackers yourself? Were you trained for this?" The man in the suit raised a hand. The noise dimmed, just slightly. "Not here," he said. "Not now." He leaned closer to Margaret, his voice low. "You understand what comes next." She did. Interviews, statements, investigations. Questions that would dig and dig until the ground she'd buried herself in collapsed. "I understand," she said. As paramedics finally reached her, guiding her toward a waiting stretcher, she waved away. Margaret felt the weight of exhaustion settle fully into her bones. The adrenaline was gone. What remained was consequence. Behind her, passengers deplaned slowly, some limping, some crying, some silent. They passed her with looks that would stay with her for the rest of her life. This was no longer just a flight. It was a reckoning. And she knew, with a clarity that hurt, that the quiet life she had built was already gone. The room was too white, too bright, the kind of clean that made every sound feel louder than it should have been. Margaret sat at the metal table with her hands folded in front of her, fingers swollen, knuckles bruised deep purple and yellow. Someone had cleaned the blood from her face. Someone had wrapped her ribs tight enough to make breathing a measured act. She ignored the ache. Pain was predictable. The waiting was not. Across from her, the man in the dark suit set a recorder on the table and did not turn it on. "Before we start," he said, "I want you to understand something." Margaret looked at him. He had not changed as much as she had expected. Older, yes, slower around the eyes, but the posture was the same. Straight, balanced, ready. "This is not an interrogation," he continued. "Not yet." She almost smiled. Almost. "Then what is it?" she asked. "An accounting." The word settled between them. Heavy. Familiar. He slid a folder across the table. No markings on the outside. Inside, a photograph. Younger. Sharper. Margaret barely recognized herself. Flight suit. Helmet under one arm. A smile she did not remember earning. "You disappeared," he said. "One day you were there, the next, nothing. No forwarding address, no requests, no noise." "I retired," she said. He nodded once. "That's what the paperwork says." "And that wasn't enough?" "No," he said quietly. "It never is." Margaret leaned back in her chair and immediately regretted it. Her breath hitched. She waited it out. He watched without comment. "They'll want a story," she said at last. "The press, the public. Something clean, something they can digest." "Yes," he said. "They always do." "And you." "And me," he agreed. She looked down at her hands. "I didn't plan this." "I know." That surprised her. She met his eyes again. "You do?" "I do," he said. "Because if you had planned it, there would have been fewer broken bones." A beat. Then, despite herself, she let out a short breath that might have been a laugh. Outside the room, Voices rose and fell. The building hummed with activity. Law enforcement, federal agents, airline representatives, lawyers already sharpening knives. 3 men, he said, glancing at the folder. Not amateurs. Not exactly professionals either. Somewhere in between. The worst kind. They didn't expect resistance, Margaret said. They didn't expect you. No, she said. They didn't. He folded his hands. Why now? She did not answer immediately. The truth was not something you blurted out. It had weight. It needed space. I thought I was done, she said, finally. I spent years convincing myself that part of me was finished, that it belonged to another life. And now I know it doesn't go away just because you stop using it. He studied her face. Do you regret it? The question was careful, loaded. He watched her closely, ready to catalogue the answer. Margaret closed her eyes. Images flickered. The woman's scream, the gunshot, the weight of a body hitting the floor, the feel of bone under her elbow. No, she said. I regret that it was necessary. He nodded. That, at least, he understood. A knock at the door interrupted them. A younger agent stepped in, eyes flicking to Margaret with open curiosity. Sir, he said, we have media pressure, and the airline wants a statement. The man in the suit stood. Give us 10 minutes. The agent hesitated, then nodded and left. He turned back to Margaret. They're going to try to make you something, he said. A symbol, a headline. They'll simplify it until it fits. And you'll let them, she said. I'll manage them, he corrected. As best I can. She exhaled slowly. What about the legal side? That depends, he said, on how cooperative you are. Margaret smiled thinly. You always did know how to phrase things. He returned the smile, just as thin. You always did know how to complicate them. Silence stretched again. Comfortable, uncomfortable, both. Harold Jensen, he said suddenly. The man in the cabin. He gave a statement. Margaret looked up. What did he say? He said you were the calmest person on the plane. That when you spoke, people listened. That you never once tried to be in charge. You just were. She swallowed. He shouldn't have been involved. He involved himself, the man said, as people do. Margaret nodded. I owe him. Maybe, he said, but that's not how this works. She knew that, too. The door opened again, this time without knocking. A woman in a tailored jacket stepped in, tablet tucked under her arm. Airline legal. Her smile did not reach her eyes. Margaret, she said brightly, I'm so glad you're okay. We're going to need to talk about a few things. Margaret felt her shoulders tense. The man in the suit did not move. Not yet, he said. The woman's smile tightened. The company needs to protect itself. So does she, he replied. You'll have your time. The woman hesitated, then nodded curtly and stepped back out. Margaret let out a slow breath. This is the part I hate. He looked at her. You always hated this part. Because it's not honest, she said. It's not about what happened. It's about who controls the narrative. Yes, he said. And you've never liked being controlled. She met his gaze. Neither have you. He inclined his head. Fair. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. Set it on the table. What's that? She asked. An option, he said. She did not touch it. You could disappear again, he went on. We could make this go quiet. You go back to being a flight attendant who happened to be on a bad flight. And the people on that plane. They already know what they know, he said. Time will dull the rest. She stared at the paper. For a moment, the idea tempted her. Quiet. Anonymity. No more rooms like this. And the other option? She asked. He met her eyes. You stand where you stood today, and let the world see exactly who you are. Margaret closed her eyes, not in fear, in calculation. She thought of the woman she had pulled from a gun, of Harold's steady voice, of the co-pilot's hands shaking on the controls, of the part of herself she had buried and now felt awake, sore, and undeniably alive. She opened her eyes. No, she said. He waited. I won't disappear, she continued. But I won't perform either. I'll tell the truth. All of it. They can do what they want with that. A long pause. Then, slowly, he smiled. This time, it was real. Still stubborn, he said. Still standing, she replied. He reached over and finally turned on the recorder. Then let's begin, he said. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, the story shifted again. Not toward glory. Toward reckoning. The recorder's red light stayed on longer than Margaret expected. Long enough for the questions to change shape. They started factual. Timelines, positions, who moved first, who touched what. Then they drifted, slowly, inevitably, toward motive. Toward judgment. Toward the unspoken question no one wanted to ask directly. Why her? When it finally clicked off, the room felt smaller, airless. The man in the dark suit leaned back, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. Age showed in that moment. Not weakness. Weight. That's going to complicate things, he said. Margaret shifted in her chair, careful of her ribs. It should. He looked at her sharply. You know what I mean. I do, she said. And I'm fine with it. A knock. Softer this time. Respectful. The door opened and Harold Jensen stepped in, escorted by a uniformed officer who looked uncertain about whether this was allowed. Harold had changed shirts. The bruise on his cheek was darker now, spreading like spilled ink. He held his hat in both hands. I asked to see her, Harold said before anyone could object. His voice was steady, but it took effort. Just for a minute. The man in the suit studied him, then glanced at Margaret. She nodded once. All right, he said. 1 minute. The officer closed the door behind Harold and remained outside. Silence settled again, different this time. Personal. Harold stopped a few feet from the table, as if unsure how close he was allowed to get. They're calling you a hero out there, he said. Margaret snorted softly. They always do. It's easier than asking harder questions. He nodded. I figured you'd say something like that. He shifted his weight, winced, then squared his shoulders. I wanted you to hear it from me. I didn't tell them anything you didn't already show. She met his eyes. You shouldn't have had to. Maybe, he said. But I'm glad I did. He hesitated, then went on. I spent a long time thinking the best years were behind me, that whatever mattered, I'd already done it. Today reminded me that's not how it works. Margaret looked away. Praise sat poorly with her, always had. You kept people calm, she said instead. That matters. He smiled. Guess we both stepped back into something we thought we were done with. The door opened again, ending the moment before it could get heavier. A different man entered this time. Mid-40s, crisp suit. The airline's emblem pin gleaming on his lapel. He did not offer his hand. Margaret Hale, he said. I'm Thomas Reed, Corporate Risk Management. Margaret exhaled slowly. Of course you are. Thomas ignored the tone.
First, let me say we're grateful no lives were lost.
Then say that, replied, and stop there. His jaw tightened. This incident raises serious concerns. About hijackers, she said. About protocol, he corrected. About liability. The man in the dark suit stood. This meeting is over. Thomas turned to him. With respect, this is our aircraft. And this is a federal matter, the man replied calmly. With lives involved. You'll have your chance. Thomas's eyes flicked back to Margaret, cool and assessing. You acted outside your training. I acted to keep people alive, she said. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It isn't. The stare stretched. Then Thomas gave a tight smile. We'll be in touch. When he left, the room felt warmer. Harold shifted toward the door, sensing his time was up. Take care of yourself, he said to Margaret. You too, she replied. After he was gone, the man in the dark suit sat back down. This is where it gets messy. It was always going to, she said. He studied her for a moment. You realize the airline may try to distance itself from you. They already are. And the public, he continued, will split. Some will celebrate you. Others will ask why a flight attendant had those skills in the first place. She shrugged carefully. They can ask. He sighed. You're not making this easy. I didn't think that was my job. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. No, it never was. A phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it, then looked back up. Press conference in 20 minutes. They want you there. Margaret closed her eyes. 20 minutes. Enough time to brace, not enough time to hide. I'll stand behind you, he added. I won't speak for you. She nodded. I wouldn't expect you to. They walked down the corridor together, past rooms filled with people talking in hushed tones, past officers standing guard, past windows where flashes of light bloomed and faded. Margaret felt every step in her ribs, every breath a conscious choice. Pain grounded her, kept her present. At the end of the hall, Claire Dawson stood waiting, hands twisting together. When she saw Margaret, her eyes filled instantly. They're saying all sorts of things, Claire blurted. That you're some kind of spy, that you planned it, that you… Claire, Margaret said gently. Breathe. Claire obeyed, shakily. I'm proud of you, she said, voice breaking. I don't care what they say. Margaret reached out and squeezed her hand. Thank you. The doors to the briefing room opened. Noise poured out. Voices, cameras, the low roar of anticipation. Margaret paused at the threshold, the man in the dark suit beside her. This is the last chance to step back, he said quietly. She looked at the room, at the people waiting to define her in headlines and sound bites, at the truth she carried, sharp and unwieldy. No, she said. She stepped forward. The lights hit her full in the face. Heat, glare. Someone called her name. Someone else called her a hero. Someone asked if she'd kill again if she had to. Margaret stood still until the room quieted. It took longer than she expected. When it did, she spoke. I didn't do this to be brave, she said. Her voice carried without effort. I did it because people were in danger, and I was in a position to help. Cameras clicked, pens scratched. I didn't want this part, she continued. I didn't want attention. I wanted everyone to get home. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I spent years pretending a part of my life was over, she said. Today reminded me that who you are doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. Silence now. Real silence. I'm not asking to be praised, she finished. And I'm not apologizing for what I did. I'm telling you the truth. She stepped back. The room erupted. Behind the noise, behind the questions and the flashes, Margaret felt something settle inside her. Not peace, not yet, but resolve. The reckoning was no longer coming. It had already begun.
The room did not empty when she stepped away from the podium. It surged. Voices layered over one another, questions sharpening, the press smelling blood and story in equal measure. Margaret felt a hand at her elbow again, guiding her sideways, out of the direct line of fire. She did not resist. She had said what she came to say. Everything else would be noise. Back in the quieter corridor, the man in the dark suit walked a half step behind her now, not beside. A subtle shift. He let her lead. "That's going to echo," he said. "It should," Margaret replied. Her throat burned. Not from nerves, from restraint. They passed a television mounted high on the wall. The press conference was already replaying on a loop. Her face frozen mid-sentence, eyes steady, jaw set. A chyron crawled beneath her image, words simplified, sharpened, bent towards spectacle. Former pilot or flight attendant, hero or Latin. Margaret looked away. In a small waiting room down the hall, paramedics finished their last checks. A young EMT frowned at the monitor, then at Margaret. "Your blood pressure's high. Today's been stressful," she said. He gave her a look that said this was an understatement bordering on insult, then nodded. "You should still go to the hospital. Later." He hesitated, then stepped back. He had learned, somehow, that pushing her was pointless. The door opened, and Claire Dawson slipped inside. She closed it carefully behind her, as if afraid of letting the world rush in. "They're tearing it apart online," Claire said, phone clutched in her hand like something dangerous. "Every word, every look. People who weren't even there telling you what you should have done." Margaret lowered herself into a chair and let her head rest briefly against the wall. The cool surface felt good, grounding. "That was always going to happen," she said. Claire's voice shook. "They're asking why you were on that flight, why you were really there." Margaret opened her eyes. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them you're a damn good flight attendant," Claire said fiercely. "That you're the one who reminds people to breathe when they panic. That you remember names. That you stay late to help clean up when everyone else clocks out." Margaret smiled faintly. "Thank you." Claire swallowed. They don't want that story. "No," Margaret agreed. "They rarely do." The man in the dark suit checked his watch. "We need to talk about next steps." Margaret straightened slowly, ribs protesting again. "Legal," she said. "And practical," he replied. "There will be reviews, internal and external. The airline will suspend you pending investigation." "I assumed they would." "They'll say it's standard procedure, and you'll tell me what it really is," she said. He did not deny it. "They need distance, for now." Claire's face fell. "They can't do that." "They can," Margaret said gently. "And they will." Silence settled. The hum of the building, distant footsteps, a radio crackling somewhere down the hall. "What about the hijackers?" Margaret asked. "All three are alive," he said, "in custody. The one who led it is already asking for a lawyer. The others aren't saying much." "And the captain?" "Stable," he said. "He'll recover." Margaret let out a breath she had been holding since the cockpit. A knock at the door. An officer stepped in, expression guarded. "Ma'am," he said, "there's someone asking to see you. He says you'll want to." Margaret looked up. "Who?" "Daniel Reyes." The co-pilot stood awkwardly in the doorway when she nodded him in. His uniform jacket was gone, shirt wrinkled, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. He looked older than he had in the cockpit. "I won't stay long," he said quickly.
They told me you might not be up for visitors." "I'm fine," Margaret said. It was not entirely true, but it was close enough. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, hands at his sides, searching for the right words. "I wanted to say thank you," he said at last. "Not just for today, for how you handled it. You didn't take over. You didn't freeze. You let me fly." "You were the pilot," she said. "That was your aircraft." He nodded. "Still, a lot of people wouldn't have done it that way." "A lot of people," she replied, "aren't thinking about what comes after." He studied her, curiosity and something like respect mingling in his gaze. "They're asking me questions too," he said. "About you." "And what are you telling them?" "That you knew exactly when to step in," he said, "and exactly when not to." Margaret met his eyes. "That's all anyone needs to know." He smiled, a tired, genuine thing. "They're lucky you were on that flight." Margaret shook her head slowly. "So are you." After he left, the room felt emptier. Claire wiped at her eyes and excused herself, muttering something about needing air. The man in the dark suit remained, leaning against the wall now instead of sitting. A rare informality. "You could have said more," he said, "at the podium." "I said enough." "You could have named your past, claimed it." Margaret looked at him. "And let them turn it into mythology." "No." He nodded. "You're forcing them to sit with ambiguity." "People learn more that way," she said. His phone buzzed again. He checked it, then sighed. "They're setting up another briefing. Without you this time." "Good." "There will be consequences," he said quietly. "Not all of them fair." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the weariness was still there, but something else sat beneath it now. Resolve, sharpened by pain. "There always are," she said. "I've lived with them before." He watched her closely. "You're not afraid?" She considered the question. "I'm tired," she said. "I'm sore. I'm angry in ways I haven't been in a long time. But no, I'm not afraid." Outside the building, night had settled in fully. The world had moved on to evening news cycles and dinner tables, to arguments and opinions and half-understood truths. Somewhere, someone was already writing the version of this story that would stick. Margaret stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the lights of the city, scattered and indifferent. Each one a life. Each one unaware of how close 162 people had come to not seeing another sunset. "I didn't choose this," she said softly. The man in the dark suit joined her at the window. "No," he agreed. "But you chose what you did with it." She rested her hand against the glass. It was cold, solid, real. "For a long time," she said, "I thought walking away was the same as being done. And now I know it was just postponement." He glanced at her. "What will you do?" Margaret thought of the cabin, of fear turning into action, of people listening when it mattered, of a life she had tried to outgrow and never truly left behind. "I'll wait," she said. "I'll answer what needs answering. And when this settles, I'll decide where I'm actually needed." He smiled faintly. "You always did hate being told where to stand." She returned the smile, just as faint. "I prefer to choose." Outside, a siren wailed and faded. Somewhere, a television anchor was still talking about heroes and risks and responsibility. Margaret turned away from the window. The night was far from over. But for the first time since the gun hit the aisle, she felt ready for whatever came next. The hearing room smelled like old carpet and burned coffee, the kind of place where time slowed and decisions hardened. Margaret sat at the narrow table with her hands folded, shoulders square, eyes forward. The seal on the wall behind the panel looked faded, its eagle worn smooth by decades of scrutiny and compromise. She had been in rooms like this before, years ago, wearing a different uniform, answering different questions that still tasted the same. The chair cleared his throat. "Ms. Hale," he said, voice careful, practiced. "You understand this is an administrative inquiry, not a criminal proceeding." "I understand," Margaret said. "Your counsel has advised you to limit your responses." "My counsel is not here," she replied evenly, "and I will answer what I can." A ripple moved through the panel. One man leaned back, another adjusted her glasses. They had expected defiance or fragility. They got neither. A screen lit up to her left. Grainy footage froze on a single frame. The aisle, a shadow mid-motion. Her shoulder angled just enough to redirect force. The image that had already circled the country, dissected by people who had never felt a cabin shudder under their feet. "Let's talk about this moment," the woman with the glasses said. "At the timestamp of 10:42 in the morning." Margaret nodded once. "I remember it. You were employed as a flight attendant," the woman continued. "Your training does not include close quarters engagement." "That's correct." "Yet you executed a maneuver that neutralized a hostile actor." "I prevented a man from striking a restrained passenger," Margaret said. "In that moment, that was my job." The man who had leaned back earlier leaned forward now. "You're aware that airline policy emphasizes de-escalation?" "Yes." "And you escalated." Margaret's jaw tightened, just slightly. "No," she said. "I ended it." Silence. Heavy. Evaluative. The chair steepled his fingers. "Ms. Hale, the concern here is not whether you saved lives. The concern is precedent." Margaret looked at him then. Really looked. Precedent is what happens when no one intervenes, and people die because they followed procedure instead of conscience. The woman with the glasses exhaled. "That's a compelling sentiment. It's also not policy." Margaret's voice stayed calm. Policy didn't stop the man with the gun. Another image appeared on the screen. The cockpit. Her hands on the controls. The co-pilot's face blurred beside her. "You assumed control of the aircraft," the chair said. "You are not certified on that platform." "I assisted the certified pilot," Margaret replied. "At his request." The man beside the chair frowned. "He says he doesn't remember making that request." Margaret did not flinch. He was in shock. His memory will fill in around the fear. A pause. Papers shuffled. "We've spoken to passengers," the woman with the glasses said. "Several describe you as calm, reassuring. Others describe you as different, controlled." Margaret's eyes flicked to the screen and back. "Fear sharpens perception. It can also distort it," the man said. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "It can." The chair leaned back. "You withheld information about your background when you were hired." "I disclosed everything required." "You did not disclose prior military service." "It was not required," she said. "It would have been relevant." "Relevant to what?" Margaret asked quietly. "My ability to serve drinks, to check seatbelts, to remind people to keep their hands inside the aisle." The panel did not answer. Outside the room, Claire paced. She had tried to sit, tried to read, tried not to imagine the way the questions would land. She remembered Margaret's hands during the briefing, steady despite the bandage. Remembered the way she had smiled at a crying passenger and made the fear ease just a little. Claire clenched her fists. The door opened.
A man stepped out and whispered to another. Claire caught fragments. Suspension. Review. Recommendation. Inside, the chair cleared his throat again. Ms. Hale, given the totality of circumstances, this panel will recommend temporary suspension, pending further evaluation. Margaret nodded. I expected that. You will be barred from flight duty, effective immediately. I understand. There will be an independent assessment of your actions. I welcome it. The woman with the glasses hesitated. Off the record, she said, lowering her voice. Do you regret it? Margaret considered the question. Thought of the aisle. The sound of breath returning to lungs. The weight of responsibility settling where fear had been. No, she said. I regret that it was necessary. The chair stood. The others followed. The seal loomed again, indifferent. This session is adjourned. Margaret rose slowly, the room tilting just a fraction, as exhaustion finally pressed in. She gathered her things and turned toward the door. Outside, the hallway buzzed with muted voices. Claire rushed to her side. How bad? Manageable, Margaret said. Claire searched her face. They're suspending you. Yes. They can't. They can, Margaret repeated gently. And they did. A reporter shouted her name from the end of the hall. Another camera light blinked on. Margaret stopped. Claire's hand tightened on her arm. You don't have to, Claire whispered. Margaret inhaled, exhaled. Then she turned and walked toward the noise. The questions came fast, accusatory, praising, hungry. She raised a hand. The room quieted, the way rooms sometimes did around her without her asking. I won't answer everything, she said, but I will say this. What happened on that flight was not about me. It was about people who wanted to get home. People who trusted the crew to protect them. We did. Are you a hero? Someone shouted. Margaret's mouth curved, not quite a smile. I'm a professional, she said, and sometimes that means doing more than what's written down. Another voice. Will you fly again? Margaret glanced at Claire, then back at the crowd. That depends on where I'm needed. She turned away before they could ask more. Outside, night pressed close. The air was cool, sharp. Margaret paused on the steps, feeling the ache in her bones, the thrum of consequences unfolding. A black sedan idled at the curb. The man in the dark suit stepped out and opened the door. He did not rush her. They'll spin this, he said quietly. Some will turn you into a warning. Let them, Margaret replied. Warnings keep people alive. She slid into the seat. The door closed softly. As the car pulled away, she watched the building recede, its lights blinking like distant stars. For years, she had tried to step out of the current, to live small, to believe that restraint was the same as peace. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Thank you for my mother. She made it home. Margaret closed her eyes and let the words settle. The road stretched ahead, dark and uncertain. Whatever came next would not be quiet, and she was done pretending that it needed to be. The room was quiet in the way only secure places ever were. Thick walls, no windows, air filtered until it smelled like nothing at all. Margaret Hale sat alone at the table, hands resting flat, palms down, feeling the faint vibration of machinery somewhere deep in the building. The world had learned her name by now, learned just enough to build myths and arguments and headlines. But this room did not care about any of that. This room only cared about outcomes. The door opened without drama. No knock, no announcement. The man who entered was older than she expected, late 60s maybe, posture still straight, but softened by time. His hair was white, cut short. His suit was dark, unadorned.
He carried no folder, no tablet, just himself. "Margaret," he said, taking the seat across from her. "Thank you for coming." She met his eyes. "I didn't have a choice." A hint of a smile touched his mouth. "You always do. Some people just see them more clearly." Silence settled between them. Not hostile, not warm. Evaluative. "You've read the reports," she said. "I have," he replied. "I've also read what didn't make it into them."
That's usually more interesting.
"It is," he agreed. "And more dangerous." He folded his hands. "You disrupted a hijacking. You prevented multiple civilian deaths. You assumed control of a commercial aircraft without certification and landed it safely. You did all of that while officially being a flight attendant with no declared background that would explain any of it." Margaret did not respond. "Some people want you punished," he continued. "Some want you paraded. A few want you buried under paperwork until the public forgets." "And you," Margaret said. "I want you useful." There it was, clean, honest. "You already have people like me," she said. "Plenty of them." "Yes," he said, "we do. But most of them are loud, or proud, or still chasing something they lost. You tried to walk away. That disqualifies me?" "It qualifies you," he said quietly. "People who stay when they're tired are dangerous. People who leave and come back when it matters are rare."
Margaret leaned back, the chair creaking softly. "You want to put me back into a box I broke myself out of? I want to offer you a different one." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. No header, no seal, just text. "Consultant," she read. "Advisory capacity. Training and crisis response." "No rank," he said. "No uniform. No public role." "And no deniability," she added. He nodded. "You won't disappear again, but you won't be owned either." Margaret stared at the paper. She thought of the cabin, the sound of a body hitting the floor, the weight of a yoke in her hands, the look in the eyes of people who thought they were about to die. "I told myself I was done," she said. "So did I," he replied. "At least twice." A faint hum filled the pause. "What happens if I say no?" she asked. "Then you live your life," he said. "You teach safety seminars. You write a book if you want. You become a symbol people argue about at dinner." "And if I say yes?" "Then when something like that flight happens again, you're not improvising alone." Margaret exhaled slowly. "You think it will happen again?" He did not hesitate. "I know it will." She picked up the paper, folded it once, then again, and set it back down. "I don't want to be a hero." "Good," he said. "Heroes burn out. We're looking for professionals." Another silence, heavier now, layered with acceptance. "I have conditions," Margaret said. "I expected that." "I choose my involvement. I don't get sent, I get asked." He nodded. "I don't lie to civilians to protect optics." A pause, then, "Within reason. And when I say stop," she finished, "it stops." The man studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Agreed." She shook it. His grip was firm, respectful. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the edge of the world gold. Margaret stepped into the evening air and felt the weight of the building fall away behind her. Her phone buzzed. Messages she hadn't answered yet. Claire. A passenger. A number she didn't recognize that somehow felt familiar. She walked instead of reading them, letting the noise of the city ground her. People laughed. Cars passed. Someone argued about parking. Life, stubborn and ordinary. At the crosswalk, a woman recognized her, hesitated, then simply said, "Thank you."
Margaret nodded once and kept walking. Later that night, she stood on her balcony, the city spread below like a living circuit board. She thought about the version of herself who had boarded that flight thinking it would be quiet, invisible, safe. That version was gone. Not replaced by something louder or crueler, but by something clearer. Some people carried strength like a weapon. Others carried it like a responsibility. She knew which one she was now. The world would keep testing its luck. That was inevitable. And when it did, she would decide how to answer. If this story stayed with you, tap like, subscribe, and comment 3 words.